the history behind this, from what information we have, that it was supposed to be like an ancestral doll. And the emphasis here is that when we're looking at African spirituality or religiosity, say, for instance, and we're looking at forms of imagery, we usually find that imagery is usually constructed using wood and stone. So what makes this piece unique is that it's created out of metal, which is iron, okay? The other thing I want to emphasize as well about the iron is that we're going to look at, aspects of the iron trade, in Africa, and looking at what iron was used for. So in order to understand, we need to break down some rudimentary points in what is culture. So according to John G. Jackson, he says culture is a pattern behavior. So culture is a way in which people interact and socialize with one another. This is what culture is. So every person has a culture. Culture should not be seen as being superior and inferior. The best way of looking at culture is looking at it as being unique and different, not superior, inferior. Okay, so we're going to look at these 7 particular points here. We'll break this down. This is how we're going to understand culture. Now, culture should be, the first thing that when we look at these things, these are referred to as social or cultural constructs. Every society has these principles. Every society has these principles. So when we look at language communication is always in 2 forms. One is verbal communication, the other one is non-verbal communication. And as a statue would tell us, this is a non-verbal communication. What's the statue trying to tell us? What was on the mind of the creators or the people that created this statue? What was the meaning and significance and the symbolisms behind it? Okay, the next one is a belief system. Now, most people think a belief system is religious or faith-based. No, every person on the planet within any culture has a belief system. The only difference is if it's not religious, it's not faith-based. That's the only thing, but they all have a belief system. So this is the other aspect when we're looking at culture. And these principles here, I want you to acknowledge when we look further into understanding the African spiritual or religious system that surrounds the iron doll. To try to understand what the Central Africans were thinking when they constructed this spiritual doll, which was supposed to be associated with their ancestors. So for me, when I was doing my research, etc., the thing that I got to my research was one of the reasons why they did it with iron was because they were quite a high-tech culture. That's one of the aspects. They were high-tech culture. So they went through their next phase of their social development. The next thing when I wanted to focus on, when I looked at the doll to focus on, was looking at the face. And one thing I noticed about the face was that they actually had the statue smiling, which was an indication of them being happy with the ancestor who this was supposed to represent. And then the ancestor who's supposed to represent this image is happy with them. So this is what culture is about when we're looking at, language, non-verbal communication. What is the statue trying to tell us? What's the belief system trying to tell us? What's the norms, the values, the customs? Okay. When they talk about the Stone Age in Europe, they usually talk about the Stone Age in Europe. It doesn't mean the Stone Age in Asia and Africa. Okay. We know that they were at a metallurgical stage at that particular period.
Can I then bring the question, the issue of who owns the narrative and what the narrative of objects within, whether it's museum settings or other settings, and what people think of, you said, for example, that the doll is primitive or will be deemed primitive. People's thoughts, basically. I just want to get people's thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. This isn't really my thoughts, but it was more of an interesting observation that I experienced when me and my friend went to go visit the Louvre in Paris, and it was just quite interesting to see the actual section that was part of African history. First of all, it was so hard to find, and it was very limited, and it was you had to go all the way down to the basement, and it was just in a way, it just sort of portrays how important they sort of deem African history. And I mean, you can only expect so much because it is a French museum, but it's just all the other sort of countries were, you know, well portrayed, and we only got like a very small representation. And on top of that, it was just so hard to actually access. So that was just an observation that we found quite interesting when we went to go visit Le Louvre.
And in addition to that, there's a distinction that is often made between artworks that come from the continent and artworks that come from the West. So in places like the Louvre, traditionally, African objects are described as ethnographic objects, whereas artworks from the West are described as artworks. And that distinction is also always automatically one of value between objects that are part of some slightly backward culture, so-called backward culture, and objects that are high art. And that's especially interesting when you think about the fact that modern art was actually set off by African art objects. So Picasso, who everyone knows, walked into an exhibit of ethnographic objects, very much like the one that you found in the Louvre, and was then inspired to come up with Cubism, which is 100% African masks recycled by a white man on a canvas, which we would today call cultural appropriation. But that's not the way art history is being taught.
And to extend just spirituality in general on the continent, we don't look at it with any sort of significance now. It's become sort of this traditional symbolic kind of thing that unless you're in some rural part of any country, you take a pick, it's not got that much relevance.
I was going to ask, with this spiritual doll, like, what does it do and how does it affect another person? Did they use the spiritual doll if they had a problem with another person, so that was their way to come back and attack the person?
But it's not like one of those dolls that you see in a movie where, you know, somebody uses it for, you know, a particular purpose. It's more like a representative. Think in terms of like a statue of maybe a king.
I have a question as well. Where does the boundary fall for, or the measurements for describing such as witchcraft? Because I always see people bring in, you know, it's witchcraft, it's this, it's that, but what separates each from the other then? What is good, what is bad?
And this idea of witchcraft is largely something, or even this idea of kind of the good and the bad, heaven and hell, is massively from that kind of missionary interpretation. And it was used to demonize traditional religions, to say, this is not Christian, so this is automatically witchcraft, these are demons, this is a kind of, yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting.
In your own opinion, with the whole African spirituality and stuff like that, do you think witchcraft is a good thing or a bad thing? In your own opinion, like even towards like the whole African spirituality and stuff, like in your own opinion, what do you think it is?
Well,
like in your own.
Yeah, in my own opinion, from my understanding of history, yeah, it didn't become witchcraft until colonization, because the word witch is a European or English word, which is associated with the witch hunts. Now, when women in Britain or Europe were practicing medicine, it was considered evil. Medicine can only be practiced by males. Okay, so what happened was, with that turmoil that was taking place with the witch hunts and all these other type of things, when they went into the African continent, they started to see what they referred to as spirituality or religiosity being opposite to what they had to offer. They started to look at it negative and try to say that it was evil. But who said, you know, where's the evidence that what they were practicing was to do with spirituality? It could have been another tribe or another group that had a particular practice that the Europeans synthesized with religiosity or spirituality.
So if you're not exactly brought up in this belief system, are we actually the people that should actually be speaking about this culture? Because what do we really know? Because, you know, I have said it a long time ago, and this is not, I mean, trying not to be offensive to anybody else, I think the diaspora has become the new colonialists. you know, where we actually now, you know, I mean, that's what I think. That's a personal thing.
Okay, I don't 100% agree with that statement that they've become the new colonialists. I think that there is to a large extent a neo-colonialism that's embedded in people that have been removed from, you know, the culture, yes. But I don't think that they're actively being. Maybe it's just like they're slight terms. Maybe you meant it in a different way as well. But I think if you look at somebody who has been majorly influenced by neo-colonialism, then yes, you can see that they will agree to some of the things that make up colonialism, but they don't have quite the same position to enforce colonialism. So they can't be the new colonialists.
Because I think things are very kind of clouded slightly in relation to what does witchcraft actually mean within an African context. And within my understanding of witchcraft and in Tanzania and the practices that I'm seeing in Tanzania, we have supposedly what they're called witches, but they're actually traditional healers or traditional doctors, and people would go to them for various services. So it could be them ill or wanting to get wealthy or wanted to pursue their personal ambitions in various things. And they would go to both places. So there's no way I can say one is better than the other. And I've been raised in that culture where to some extent I practice both of them. I think when I was young it was more so to do with the tradition, but growing older, also coming from a very strong Christian background, you live in that culture as well. But no, I think we as Africans tend to associate witchcraft in a very negative connotation.